So our next speaker, without further ado, it's Marius Obert. Marius studied in Karlsruhe, and he started his career as a UI developer in sunny California at SAP Labs, where he learned to love web technologies like UI5, JavaScript, and the Node.js ecosystem. Then he relocated back to Munich to work as a developer advocate for the SAP Cloud Platform and SAP UI technologies. And he's here to inspire his peer developers around the globe to build scalable cloud-native enterprise apps. He also keeps current with cryptocurrencies, so we have to talk about the beer at the Stammtisch, and distributed ledger technologies. So without further ado, Marius with serverless SAP Fiori apps in SAP Cloud Platform. Thank you, Marius.
Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Let me start sharing my screen. And I also want to say I'm super impressed with the timing of everyone. So we are really perfectly on time. That's cool. So let me share my screen. You should see the presentation now. As Andrea already said, my name is Marius Obert, and today I want to talk about SAP serverless SAP Fiori apps in SAP Cloud Platform. And actually, that's also the title of a blog post that I've written a couple of weeks ago, and it got a lot of traction. So I thought, apparently, many people are interested in the topic, and I think I had the idea to come up with a presentation about the same topic as the blog post, and I hope you like it. Here's the agenda that I want to cover. So first, I want to show you an approach how we used to deploy web apps on the Cloud Foundry environment. And then I will show you, in contrast to the older approach, the new one that we can use to deploy serverless web apps on SAP Cloud Platform. And after I talked a little bit about the concept, I will show you the live demo. And last but not least, I have a couple of links for you to show you how to get started and to do or to reproduce what I showed in the live demo. So what we see here is basically an architecture diagram of the runtime setup, how we used to deploy web apps on Cloud Foundry. So we had like users that want to consume a web application. They send different requests to the web app that is here a Node.js application, to be more specific, an application router. And the request could be about sending login information, being redirected to a SSO server, requesting UI files such as like UI5 web component, web applications, controllers and views. And obviously we want to display data from SAP systems. So somehow we have to get SAP data as well. And what the application router in that legacy approach did is that it basically redirected all login related traffic to the user account and authentication service in the Cloud Foundry environment. I also call this UAA service. And UI files, they were requested directly from an embedded folder in the application router. So they were basically served straight from the app router itself. And the SAP data was requested via the destination service from an on-premise or from a cloud system that is connected to the SAP Cloud Platform. And that was the legacy approach. I would say we used that up until 2 to 3 years ago. And then after that, we introduced this the HTML5 application repository. And the only difference that it happens here is that we put the web application, like the static resource files, in a separate repository service. And then the application router also redirects traffic to that service. And now the application router basically only acted as a reverse proxy. So a normal proxy basically gets multiple inputs and redirects it to one destination. And the reverse proxy does the other side. It gets different inputs and it redirects it to different places. And this is all based on the configuration. So you don't have to do a lot of coding for the application router. You just need to provide a file that could look like that one that we see here, the access_app.json file, where you define the starting path, which is here, contains the name of an application. That is in that case here, hello world app router, and the file name. It specifies the authentication method, which we set here to route, and that's a keyword to involve the UAA service. And we define 2 routes. The first route basically picks up all traffic that starts with V2 and redirects it to the destination with the name Northbound. That's where we involve the destination service. And the second route redirects traffic to the HTML5 application repository. And I'm sure some of you are now thinking, wait a second, didn't Marius tell me the exact same thing 1 year ago? Because I actually gave a presentation about that legacy approach and that approach that I called 2019 here at a SAP Insight Track in Munich, as well as in the Insight Track in Vienna. And that's why I don't want to go into detail here, but what I want to show is like what we did since I gave that last presentation. So we basically extended the scenario a little bit to make it more applicable for hosting SAP Fiori applications, for example. So let me go back one slide first. So this is the architecture, the runtime setup that I described, but it's only the runtime setup. And when I go back to this, go forward to this slide here, we basically see the entire deployment scenario or the full architecture diagram, because you need a so-called deployer application to actually take your web application and to store it in the HTML5 application repository. So this is like a Node.js script that has your web application as an attachment. And once you deploy this Node.js script to the Cloud Foundry environment, it will take the attachment and move it to this repository service. Similarly, when we're talking about Fiori applications and you want to test them in a Fiori Launchpad, you need a Fiori Launchpad module. So this is also a service that we provide on SAP Cloud Platform that you need to configure as well. So we have the configuration in a file that is called common data model.json. And for that, you also need a deployer application that takes the file and uploads it or moves it to the service instance. So it is configured appropriately for your application. And then, as in the previous slide, we see there's a UAA and a destination service. And we have this app router that basically redirects or dispatches all incoming requests to the different destinations. So for example, when the user wants to load the FLP Launchpad, these files are served from the Launchpad module. The web application, the Fiori application in that case, would be served from the HTML5 application repository. And these two servers are still in charge for the SSO login and retrieving destinations from SAP systems. And you can basically see in this diagram here that we have three backend components or server components. There are these two Cloud Foundry tasks, and they don't cause a lot of cost because they only run once you deploy the application for a couple of seconds until they do their job, which is moving an attachment to a service, and then they don't consume memory any longer, and they don't result in cost therefore. But you still see them in the cockpit, you still see them in the CLI, and you might be confused or annoyed by them when you see them all the time. And that's why it would be nice to get rid of them. And the biggest cost is basically caused by the application router that we see here. And that router runs 24/7 because obviously you always want to be able to access your Fiori applications. And you need to have that component in place to dispatch the incoming traffic. And that's why it's also not only a critical component, but the more traffic you get, the stronger this component needs to be. So you need to assign more memory, or you need to scale out, which means add multiple instances in parallel. And that could obviously increase the cost or the TCO of your entire solution. The good news is that you can basically only use one app router for multiple web applications at the same time. So if you have like 5 applications stored in here, one app router is sufficient. But obviously, all the traffic that goes towards these 5 Fiori applications needs to pass the same app router. So this app router needs to be very strong. And the good news that I have today with the serverless approach is that we can now get rid of all of these 3 components here. So we can get rid of the app router, get rid of the app deployer, and of the content launchpad config deployer. What we have to do is to replace the Cloud Foundry task here on the right side is that we can basically use a native feature of the Cloud Foundry deploy service to actually move the attachments directly to service instances. So we don't need an application. We can just add some directives to say, okay, take that content and move it in here. And we don't need a separate application that does that for us. And that will also unify. So we'll be able to use the same configuration interface for the web app deployer, as well as for the Launchpad config deployment. And then besides that, we will use the Launchpad subscription, which is a software as a service that is offered on the cloud platform that already comes with features of the application router. So basically, when I move to the next slide, you will see that the app router here has been replaced with the Launchpad subscription. We can just leverage what's already there, and because it brings all the features that we need, we don't need to host our own app router, and we don't need a deployer for the web application that uploads it, because we'll use the native interface that I'll show you later. And as the Launchpad subscription already comes with the full Fiori Launchpad, we don't need the Launchpad module any longer. I know this all is a lot of like words now and explanations, but I hope you will understand it better in the demo later, or also in the blog post that is linked at the end. And the configuration of a web application looks exactly the same as what we've seen before. We have this accessapp.json file where we define the UAA service, the destination service, and the HTML5 application repository. But now this is the configuration of our web application. Before, let me go back for a second to that slide here. This was the configuration of our application router. And now we basically took the configuration of the application router and push it one level down to our Fiori application. So let me go back to this slide here. And that is really the only difference. So we changed the welcome file, because obviously we don't need to reference the web application from the web application itself. But other than the welcome file, this is the exact same file content. And now you might wonder, if there's no app router involved, how do I access my web application? Because as you might know, before we used the URL of the Node.js application of the app router to redirect or dispatch traffic to our web application. But now, as there's no app router involved, which will be the URL that we use to access the web application. And for that, we added a new property to the manifest.json. This is the descriptor of our SAP UI5 application. And this new property has the name sap.cloud, and there's a subproperty called service, and you could basically give it any string that you want. It just has to be a string that you can remember. And besides this new property, we depend on two old properties, but you probably already have them in your web applications. We need an ID for the SAP UI5 application or the Fiori application, and it has to have a version. And with these three values, we can follow the pattern that you see down here to assemble the URL under which the web application is accessible. So it will be the ID of your sub account, .launchpad.cfapps.region, which is probably EU10 for you, .hana.ondemand.com / the service. So that's the value of this property here, .id, which is this value here, -version. And in my example, it would look like that. You will notice that dots are removed from the service as well as from the ID. So that's why there is no dot between cloud and service here, and also no dot in here. The only dot in the string is used to separate the service from the ID and to define the version. And actually the version is optional, so you can leave the version string out. That works as well. And in this case, you will always see the latest version of your web application. But in case you want to have two versions of the same UI deployed at the same time, you can basically, for A/B testing, for example, you can specify which version you want to target in the URL as well. A second thing that comes with this URL change is that here you see that this is the URL where you can access the web application, and you configure all routes on the level of your web application. So when you, for example, have a data source and you define the URI of the data source, you need to make sure that it does not start with a slash. Before that was okay, because when it was starting with a slash, that basically meant that you have to define the route on the level of the application router. But as there is no application router anymore, you need to define it on the level of the web application. And therefore, you need to use a relative route here instead, because otherwise it won't be clear which route should be mapped to which destination. And I already mentioned the biggest benefit, the lower total cost of ownership of this new serverless approach, because you save memory, or memory hours to be more precise. But the second big advantage is that it will be easier to integrate Fiori apps in the Fiori Launchpad. So in this screenshot here, you see the UI of the Fiori Launchpad admin user interface. And when you want to create a new application in your Fiori Launchpad, you always have to click New App to create new application artifact, define a title, a description, define how the app should be opened, and copy and paste the URL of your application router in here. Or you could create a destination with the URL of your application router and reference it as a system. But as there is no application router and no URL of an application router, you can basically use this new feature of the admin UI, which is called the Content Explorer. So you can click on Content Explorer, select HTML5 apps, which will show you all applications that are in this HTML5 application repository. You can just select the application that you want to add to the Launchpad. You see the description and the ID, and these information are extracted from the manifest.json file. Just select the item here and click to add to my content, and then you will see the application in your Fiori Launchpad after you assign the role and a group to it. So that makes it easier and also removes redundant working steps. So that's so much about the theory and the concepts of this new serverless approach. As a summary, I would say, obviously the biggest advantage is that it saves you money. The deployment is faster, as you will see in a second in the live demo. It scales well, and the even better part about scaling is that you don't have to deal with it, because it will just, you upload a web application, say, here's the web application, and then you start consuming it, accessing it, but you don't have to worry about monitoring how much memory your app router is consuming, and if you need to scale it out or scale it up, you just don't have to worry about it, and you can consume it. I already mentioned also that the architecture is simplified, because now you don't have to worry with these Cloud Foundry tasks that these artifacts are still laying around. You don't have to make sure that the latest version of these deployment modules is used or that you update them. You can just use the native deployer interface to make sure your web application ends up in the HTML5 application repository. And I just showed you in the previous slide the FLP Launchpad or the admin UI integration, that you don't have to copy and paste values from A to B. There are two minor differences. One is that it currently, in the approach that I will show you in a second, it creates sub-account destinations to handle this configuration of the different components. And it would be cleaner if it was to create service instance destinations, and that's something we are working on. The second small disadvantage is that it requires some refactoring, and by that I mean what I just showed you, that you basically replace absolute URLs with relative URLs, that you make sure that all your data sources are defined in the manifest.json, and maybe you also send a couple of requests straight from the controller, and then you need to make sure that they also use relative URLs versus absolute URLs. Overall, I would say the advantages outweigh the disadvantages by far, but there could still be reasons. So I don't want to tell you, get rid of your app routers tomorrow. You could still continue to use it, especially if you have like larger projects. For example, if you have a CAP project where you have an app router that is already involved, you might as well continue to use the app router for your Fiori apps that are connected to the CAP project as well. So it's okay to keep them. In this case, I would still recommend to consider at least using this GACD interface to get rid of the deployer modules, but continue the app router to dispatch the traffic to the HTML5 application repository or to your CAP backend. So, so much about the concepts. Now let's come to the live demo. The only thing that I prepared is basically that I already subscribed to this Launchpad subscription service that is available in the free trial. And what we do now is that we provision these 3 service instances and upload the web application in the HTML5 application repository. So for that, let's go over here. So here you see my project that is also available on GitHub, by the way. On the right-hand side, you see the SAP Cloud Platform Cockpit. I just refreshed it, so you see that that it takes a second to load. So now you see that I actually have a dev space here, but I have no memory assigned to this dev space, which is not a problem because I don't want to deploy any anything in the Cloud Foundry runtime. I just want to create a couple of services. And I also want to show you that there are currently no destinations in here either. So let me trigger everything with this npm run deploy command. Here I opened a package.json file, so you see what happens when I execute npm run deploy. It basically just calls the MBT tool to package everything and then executes cf deploy to upload the mtar project to the Cloud Foundry deploy service, but it won't consume any memory or runtime, Cloud Foundry runtime. The web application itself is pretty standard. So we see here, let me make it a little bit bigger. So we see here there is the standard FLP sandbox bootstrap and a UI5 bootstrap happening here. And in our sandbox, we only have one application that has the title available categories, and it basically represents the SAP UI5 application with the ID com SAP Fiori app. So when I open the manifest file, here we see that this is the application that is referenced com SAP Fiori app. It has a version and it has this new SAP Cloud Service property. And here the value is just cloud.service. By the way, you already saw that the deployment here is already finished. So it is really fast now. And besides that, I obviously use, as I've said before, relative routes instead of absolute routes here. And in this access-app.json file, I basically pick up that relative route and redirect that traffic to the northbound destination that has also been created. So when I refresh here, you see that there are 3 destinations, or there should be 3 destinations. Yes, one is northbound, and the 2 other destinations are these internal destinations that I mentioned previously that connect the different components to each other. Yeah, and that's all I want to show on the coding side and the deployment. So let's switch over to Chrome here. Let me refresh that page. And now we should see the FLP sandbox. So this is not yet a real Fiori launchpad. It is only like this. It's what is provided via this UI5 test resources here. But I can already click on it to open the application. And I can then just click go and select all tables or all columns that I want to display to see the data from the northbound service. So what you see here is that it is that I currently, it's only a list report application, so I cannot yet click on an item, on a line item, but we can change that easily here in the manifest file, because I just can undo. So previously there was an object page, I removed it. Let's undo that for a second to bring the object page back. And now I want to deploy, because the first time the deployment was already fast, but it also created the service instances. It created some service keys. And when I run it a second time, it should be even faster now. While it's running a second time, let's have a look at the mta.yaml file to show you what is actually happening in the Cloud Foundry environment here. So we see we have 3 resources, which means 3 service instances, one for the UAA service, one for the HTML5 application repo, and one for the destination service. This is all pretty standard, just nothing special going on here. And we have 3 modules that are not really modules in the sense that you probably know them before, because nothing is deployed on the Cloud Foundry runtime. By the way, the deployment finished here already now. So the first module basically represents this web application where we say, okay, there is it should use our own build command, which is called npm run build, and the supported platform is an empty string, empty array, and that means so we could say empty array CF should mean this module should be deployed to a Cloud Foundry environment, but not to Neo environment, for example, or not to to the Access Advanced environment. But if we say empty array, it shouldn't be deployed anywhere. So this is just a pseudo module if you want. And we use the pseudo module for our deployer application, because the deployer application requires the HTML5 application repository, and it requires this pseudo module, and to be more specific, it requires the zipped version of the pseudo module. And then this deployer is that native deployer that I mentioned previously. So it just takes the zip file and uploads it in the HTML5 application repository. But there is no component involved. And I can also show you that when I click on Cloud Foundry Spaces here, you see we have 3 source instances, but no application, none is started, none is stopped, because this is all a native feature of the deployer service of the Cloud Foundry environment. And that you also see that with this type SAP application content. Similarly, the last module here is of the same type. It requires the services I mentioned below. And when we look at the require section, we see that it also creates service instances, service keys for the service instances. So it creates a service key for the UAA service. It creates a service key for the HTML5 app repo service. And here it just references the destination service. And when we scroll down here, we see that it basically creates 2 sub-account destinations. It creates the destinations on the sub-account. It updates them if they already exist. And here in this array, we see it creates 2 of them. So one with that name and one with that name. And when I switch over here to the destinations, we see these are the 2 other destinations besides the Northern service that have been created. Okay, so much about what I didn't show you the new application, right? So let me refresh the page here. And now we should see that we are able to drill down one level from the list report application to an object page. So I click on Go again, select a couple of columns. And now we see this arrow here. And when we click on it, we end up at an object page that is empty because we didn't add any annotations. But we see that this is the new version that has been deployed now. What I also can show you here is in the admin UI of the real Fiori Launchpad, so not the sandbox, that I can click here in the content provider. I see that I'm connected to the HTML5 apps. So this is my HTML5 application repo. When I go to the content manager, content explorer, click on HTML5 apps, I basically see this application here, and now I could add it to my content. What is interesting is that you could have multiple content provider. Here I only have one, but for example, an S4 system could also be a content provider. So when you connect your S4 system to this Launchpad, you can basically also go to the Content Explorer, select another tile here, and select Fiori applications from your on-premise systems as well. Okay, and I think that's all that I want to show. Let's go back to the slides. Here, there's something good that I put that slide there to remind me. I already showed you that the 2 new destinations. Oh, 1 second. The 2 new destinations here, they were created by this section here in the deployer. But the Northwind destination hasn't been there before my deployment. And I created it with this destinations.json file that I referenced here in the service instance provisioning part. And basically the content of that file is what you see here in this slide. So it has a similar structure. So it starts with, it's a JSON object, it has this inner data, but here there is the sub account that we've also seen in the mta.yaml. We have this existing destination policy property, and then we have an array of destinations that can just define any destinations that you want, because now you don't have to go to the SAP Cloud Platform Cockpit to create new destinations. You can define them in the code, in your application, store them in GitHub or whatever Git or version control you use. And you can bring these pieces together that logically belong together. And every time you deploy the application, it will make sure the destination is there. You can say update the destination with every deployment, but you can also set this to ignore, and then it will just ignore the destination if it already exists, and it won't override it. Yes, and that was most part of my presentation. Here are a couple of links that you will be able to find once I share the slides with you. This is, as I mentioned, a blog post that this presentation here is based on. I also have other blog posts that cover the topic of the HTML5 application repository and how you can store non-UI5 apps in it. So there are 2 blog posts here. There is a sample repo on GitHub that explains or that has samples for this legacy approach, the approach that I named with 2019 in my first slide, and the approach that I just showed you in this presentation. All samples are available on GitHub, and actually the application that I just deployed in the live demo is one of these samples. This is the link to the presentation of last year. So if you want to learn more about the HTML5 application repository, check out this YouTube video. And here are a couple of tutorials that you could do to do the same as what I've done in this live demo here. And with that, yeah, thanks for your attention. This QR code brings you to the presentation, to the slides. And I would say, let's open it for questions now.
Thank you. There are some in the queue. Thank you, Marius. So Wolfgang Röcklein had a question. The first one was, do WebSocket connections to the destination work?
What? Can you repeat that question?
As you don't have your own managed app router, does this central approach supports WebSockets to be forwarded to the destination?
I'm honestly not sure, but you can leave a comment under the blog post and I will try to find out and respond to that comment.
Mm-hmm. And next question also from Wolfgang, is there still a limit on the number of apps per HTML5 repo?
No, so there is, so when we create a new service instance, then you define the size of that repo. So you say, for example, 3 megabyte, and then you can only upload 3 megabyte in this particular container, so to say. But that doesn't mean that the overall size is limited. So there, we used to have a limitation that says you have 5 megabyte per gigabyte of Cloud Foundry application runtime, but that has been removed. So now there shouldn't be a limitation. It could be that your container is full, but you should be able to create a second container also. Yep.
Okay. And one question for me, I tried out your example already. You've seen my pull requests and comments. Yeah. And what you mentioned this example of having a CAP backend, and then you want to have your HTML5 application separate. And you showed this dynamic or this destination creation by code. Is there any way to, because when I deploy my CAP application with an MTA, I will get assigned, or it depends what endpoint will be created depending on the organization, sub account I'm in. So is there a way to dynamically link and create this destination?
Yeah, that's, I didn't spend too much time, but from what I've seen, it's not possible yet. So I showed you how to create, I mean, there are 2 ways to create destinations during deployment, in the MTA YAML and in this destinations.json file. The destination.json file is a static file, but that could create any destination as you want. But obviously, when you define the file, you need to hard code the URL of your CAP service. And I mean, you could guess it, but it's not very dynamic. But if you know this will be the URL of my CAP application, you could hard code that value in the JSON file. The other approach in the mta.yaml is a little bit more dynamic, but as of today, it only works with this to inject service key information in the destination. So that cannot be used for basic authentication, for example.
No, good. Who wants to do basic authentication?
Yeah, I mean, but any
and
other
you don't want to have
this.
basic authentication somewhere in a Git repo.
Yeah, that's but okay, that's not really related to the question, but you can still create a destination without a password, so you can basically pre-fill everything. Then you only need to go to the cockpit to enter your password, but all other properties will be there, so it will still take some work of you.
Okay, so might you think that the approach having perhaps still a mono repo where the front end and back end is included, but then just simply do for like quick UI changes, do like only this partial deployment?
So I'm a fan of mono repos. I know others are not, so probably it's a personal preference, but I think that makes sense. And you could even go a step further and just use this the HTML5 plugin of this Cloud Foundry CLI to not even use partial deployment, but you just directly upload the web application in the repository, or use partial deployments. Yeah.
It's
And you see in the deployment
about.
is really fast, especially if the source instances are already there.
Yeah. Okay. Very nice. Now let's have a look on Mike Meister's graphic recording. Yeah. Nice picture of you. And let's zoom in. Mike, can you zoom a little bit in to get it bigger? Yeah. So here we go. So
cool. Thank you, Mike.
Supercons, yeah, nice. Deploy one. Fiori Launchpad is running in the cloud.
It's hopefully I got some of the points. It's sometimes it's a little bit hard if you go in such deep dives to catch what is important. But I think it's.
Yeah.